Today, we're going inside one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Think about this. December 13th, 1937, a city of 1 million people. No army left to defend it, no government, and no protection. What happened over the next 6 weeks would absolutely shock the world. And believe it or not, it's still disputed nearly 90 years later. This is the story of the Nanjing Massacre, and it's a story that absolutely must be told. So, to really get what happened, you first have to understand the political climate in Asia back in the 1930s. Honestly, it was a tinderbox just waiting for a spark. You see, by this time, Japan had built up one of the most powerful military forces on the planet. And this military was driven by this intense nationalist ideology, this core belief that Japan was destined to dominate all of Asia.
And this ambition, well, it wasn't just talk. Back in 1931, Japan had already seized Manchuria. Then, in July 1937, a full-scale war exploded. The Japanese army started this brutal march south from Shanghai, fighting its way toward China's capital city, Nanjing.
Now, Nanjing wasn't just any other city. It was a huge deal. It was the capital of nationalist China, the seat of the entire government, and a really powerful symbol of Chinese identity. Japan figured if they could just take Nanjing, China would have to surrender. So as Japanese forces got closer and closer, China's leader Chiang Kai-shek had to make a truly impossible decision, and the fate of 1 million people was hanging in the balance. So what do? Do you order your army to fight to the very last man inside the city? Or do you pull back your best troops to save them for the longer war? He made the fateful choice to withdraw. And that decision, well, it left the city and all its people just terrifyingly vulnerable. Nanjing was now defended by only a few untrained soldiers, surrounded by a massive civilian population that had absolutely nowhere to go. But, in the middle of this growing sense of dread, there was this tiny glimmer of hope. A small but pretty extraordinary group of Western businessmen and missionaries, they refused to leave. And they organized something called the Nanjing Safety Zone. It was just a small pocket of supposed neutrality in a city right on the brink of war. On December 13th, 1937, the city gates were breached. The Japanese Imperial Army entered Nanjing, and what happened next wasn't a battle. It was a complete breakdown of humanity. Just listen to this. This diary entry is from John Robb, the man who was leading the safety zone. He wrote this on the very first day of the occupation. It gives you a sense of just how immediate and unrelenting the horror was. So why? Why did this happen? It wasn't just one single order. Historians really point to a catastrophic collapse of military discipline. The soldiers were exhausted, they just marched 190 miles. Their supply lines were stretched thin, and their commanders had given them almost zero guidance on how to handle civilians or prisoners of war. Even worse, the commanding general had ordered the destruction of the city. The scale of the killing was just staggering. The War Crimes Court that was set up after World War II, the International Military Tribunal, they concluded that over 200,000 people were killed in just 6 weeks. And we're not talking about just soldiers. We're talking about families, children, the elderly. And the violence, it wasn't limited to killing. Tens of thousands of women and girls were assaulted. And while some estimates are much, much higher, most historians agree that at least 20,000 is the most conservative and credible number. On top of the human toll, the city itself was also just decimated. Japanese soldiers set fires all across Nanjing, and by most estimates, at least a third of all the buildings in the city were burned to the ground. It was left in ruins. And yet, even in the middle of this absolute nightmare, there are these stories of incredible, almost unbelievable courage. And this is a part of the history that, honestly, deserves a lot more attention. So you had this small group of foreigners, just ordinary people, who chose to stay. There was John Robb, a German businessman, who used his status to defend the safety zone, sheltering up to 250,000 people. You had Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary, who turned her college into a refuge for 10,000 women. And Bernard Sindberg, a young Danish man, who turned a cement factory into a camp that saved up to 10,000 more. So when World War II finally came to an end in 1945, the international community wanted justice. They wanted to hold those responsible for these atrocities accountable for what they'd done. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal met from 1946 to 1948. General Matsui Awane, who commanded the forces that took Nanjing, was convicted of war crimes and executed. The tribunal's findings, which were based on just overwhelming evidence, confirmed the scale of the massacre. But, and this is a big but, the accountability was incomplete. Many people who participated were never even tried. And this contrast really highlights the problem we're still dealing with today. You see, in the decades since the war, a movement of historical revisionism has popped up in Japan. Some politicians and scholars argue that the death toll was inflated, that the events were exaggerated, or in the most extreme cases, that the massacre never even happened. And this has created a deeply painful and contested history. So that brings us to the big question, right? It's been nearly 90 years. Why is it so incredibly crucial that we remember what happened? Why does this specific history still matter so much in our world today? Well, the memory is being actively and very intentionally preserved. The Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall actually stands on the site of a mass grave. China now marks December 13th as a national day of commemoration. And maybe most importantly, organizations like the USC Shaw Foundation have recorded video testimonies of the last living survivors, making sure their voices are never, ever lost. Because ultimately, the story of Nanjing, it's not just a Chinese lesson or a Japanese lesson. It's a universal human lesson. It is a terrifying example of what can happen when militarism goes completely unchecked, when soldiers are stripped of accountability, and when ideology is used to dehumanize an entire people. And that's why remembering this history is so important. It's not about assigning blame or promoting hatred. It's about honoring the victims. It's about learning from the past. And it's about committing ourselves to making sure that what happened in Nanjing is never, ever allowed to happen again. Not anywhere. Not to anyone.